We must prepare young people for the world of AI. We've got to teach them how to discern false facts. And I said to this person last night, well, how do you do that? Knowledge builds on knowledge. It's like Velcro. And if you come to school without that knowledge, you find it very difficult to acquire new knowledge.
I think this is probably the most influential book in the last 20 years in education.
I think just the way I tried to go about what I did, I tried to be less sort of party pre and factional in terms of education issues.
Do you think there really has been an actual contempt for factual knowledge, or has it just been other things have been prioritised?
The purpose of an education is to get knowledge into your long-term memory.
Are you looking for brilliant CPD that is inspiring, illuminating and impactful? Well, Inner Drive's training is evidence-informed, engaging and makes a real difference. Whether it is in person at your training days or online through our Teachers CPD Academy, Inner Drive is transforming how schools and colleges do professional development. Email us at info@innerdrive.co.uk to take your staff training to the next level.
Hello and welcome to Inner Drive's Science of Learning podcast with me, Bradley Bush. This is the podcast where we discuss the latest and indeed greatest cognitive science and educational studies. Because we believe there is absolute gold in the research, and if we can make it accessible and put in front of the right people, i.e. you, our lovely listeners, and even lovelier subscribers, we believe it can be transformational in the lives of students. Now in each episode we usually discuss 3 studies. In this episode we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to discuss 1 study and 2 books. Every time we uncover a key cognitive science principle, you will hear the principle ping. And when we discuss the nuance of application, you'll hear the nuance noise. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Nick Gibb. Nick, welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me, Bradley.
Thank you for agreeing to come on. I have so many questions I'd like to ask you because I think in terms of as a guest, it's really interesting. You oversaw a period of significant change in the education landscape, the ripple of which is still being felt in many schools, both in the UK and indeed across the world. And I thought it'd be really interesting to discuss what was the works that have influenced your thinking. Because when I was doing a bit of research for this podcast, one thing that kept seemingly coming up was everyone from all political sides of the spectrum were commented that you seem to be incredibly well-read and well-informed when you were a minister. And I thought it'd be really interesting to dig into what was the stuff you were reading and how did it shape your thought process. So we're going to do something slightly different. Instead of doing 3 studies, we thought we'd do 2 books and 1 study. And so the first book, when I asked you what influenced or what played a significant role for you, was E.D. Hirsch's book, The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them. So I thought if we jump in straight away and start, just provide some context. Where were you when you first read it? Why did you feel it was so significant? What thoughts did it kind of really start to inspire?
Well, it was 2006 and it was a beach in South Carolina.
Yeah.
And I read it on the recommendation of my researcher, Edward Hardman. And the reason why I wanted to read it was because I'd been the Shadow Schools Minister at that point for about a year, and we were declining in PISA. It started in 2000, where we were 4th, 7th and 8th in science, reading and maths. But in 2003 and 2006, we were declining. And by 2009, we had gone down to 25th in reading and 29th or 28th in maths. So I wanted to understand why. And so every Monday I was visiting schools up and down the country, really looking to just to see what I could find, talking to teachers, talking to heads. And I came to the view, but also based on my own school experience as well, that there was a kind of ideology that was causing the damage, which in shorthand you might call progressivist. There was low expectations of children, particularly in disadvantaged areas, a weak curriculum, behaviour was weak. And so, but I couldn't really pin it down. I encountered the reading wars, phonics versus whole language approaches to teaching reading, but I knew there was more. And then when I read E.D. Hirsch's The Schools We Need and Why We don't have them, it was a revelation. Now, he's an American academic. He was talking about the American school system, but everything he said applied to Britain. And it explained to me the whole notion of what progressivist or progressive education is and why it's so damaging, particularly to children from disadvantaged backgrounds.
So just on that note, because one of the questions I was going to ask you quite early on, and you touched on it there, is when I read his book, obviously it's very much written in the lens of the American landscape. Did you see complete parallels, complete overlap with what was happening in England, or did you have to try and filter to apply it to a different context? Or did you feel that his argument about the decline in American education fitted essentially perfectly with UK situations?
It was fitted perfectly. These ideas, good or bad, they kind of float around the world, particularly in the English-speaking world, the ones that come from America. So he explained that progressive education came from Teachers College, Columbia in New York, based on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's romantic, philosopher from the 18th century. His views that somehow you shouldn't be corrupting children by filling them full of knowledge of how society today runs. You should allow children to just flourish with their own natural creativity and so on. And they were against didactic teaching, they were against exams, they were against the absorption and remembering of knowledge. And so everything Hirsch talked about in his book, I could see that was what was driving poor standards in this country as well.
Okay, so if it overlaps nicely, there were a number of quotes that I wanted to put to you from the book to kind of see if you agreed with them, which I'm guessing you would if it's one of your favourite books, but also what actual tangible change they might have led to. So the first quote I wanted to go for that E.D. Hirsch talks about, he writes, the deep aversion and contempt for factual knowledge that pervade the thinking of American educators was at first so paradoxical and difficult for an outsider like me to understand or believe it that it took me many years to appreciate it. So I guess my question is, did you feel the same when you first read it, of this kind of surprise that there was this contempt towards factual knowledge within the education setting? And two, do you think there really has been an actual contempt for factual knowledge, or has it just been other things have been prioritised? Because for someone like me who was an outsider originally in education, I used to work in sport, it would surprise most people who aren't in education to hear that some people think there's a contempt for factual knowledge in education. They'd assume that has a high priority and always has.
One would assume that, but it's not the case.
Right.
And I first came across this issue when I stood in the Rotherham by-election. This was in 2004.
Yeah.
And, no, not 2004, 1994.
Right.
I'm older than I think. So this was 1994. And so I was visiting a school, and they were doing this audit of the library, and they were sort of removing a lot of books that were just factual. And I had this sort of discussion with the head, and they were saying, education is not about preparing children for a Trivial Pursuits quiz. That they don't need to remember all these things and they can look things up. So even then, and that was a surprise when I first heard that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when I went around schools, the same notion was that children can always look it up.
Yeah.
They don't need to remember vast quantities of knowledge. And I think that quote, he goes on to talk about, either there or somewhere else in the book, about rote learning. He says that rote learning is probably I think it's in the glossary at the back, like the most reprehensible word in the progressivist lexicon, because they just don't think it's important to have to commit knowledge to memory. They think it's the progressivists think it's more important to teach children the skills of how to think. So teach them how to be a problem solver or to be a critical thinker, or more specifically, how to think like a historian or how to work scientifically. Yeah. Those are the things. And I saw that when I was visiting schools around the country. They were not focused on knowledge. And then at about the same time, the Qualifications Curriculum Authority was beginning to introduce a competence-based curriculum that was all about those high-level skills. Very little actual content knowledge was specified in this new competence-based curriculum. So this, so everything he said didn't surprise me at all when I read that quote.
And that talk about sort of higher order thinking or critical thinking, creativity. One of the other quotes I was going to ask about is, he says, to stress critical thinking while de-emphasizing knowledge actually reduces a student's capacity to think critically. And I worry about this a little bit in this current context of, in a world of AI, where we're hearing lots of people talk about the need to help students think critically and use AI really well. It kind of sometimes goes hand in hand, these proponents of that argument, with, therefore students don't need knowledge. They just need the ability to be able to critique the AI. Whereas if we think this is true 20 or 30 years ago, I think maybe that's even more important now, this idea of knowledge and long-term memory. Whereas, because without it, you can't do any of that interrogation with AI or anything like, or any other means.
Yes, you hear it even more today.
Yes, you do.
They say we must prepare our young people. I heard it last night at a dinner. We must prepare young people for the world of AI. We've got to teach them how to discern false facts on the internet and that's being produced by AI. And I said to this person last night, well, how do you do that? Even I, all of my experience in politics and being 65, sometimes are hoodwinked by, something I think is true and it turns out not to be.
Yeah.
So there's no trick or skill you can teach someone about how to discern whether something that you see on the internet is true or not true. The best way is to have acquired a lot of knowledge. Then you know that these things cannot be true that you're reading when they're so absurd. And so this argument now is more strongly made about this issue. But the key thing that came out of Hirsch is that those skills they are important. There's no question in a modern economy like Britain, where our soft power, we are we're either one or number two in the world in terms of soft power, and it comes from our universities, it comes from our fashion industry, and it comes from our music, and so those are you need to be creative to have to do well in those industries. We want people to be critical thinkers. We want them to be problem solvers. But you don't get those skills from just directly teaching them. You get them from the knowledge. Yeah. And this is what, again, that quote he goes on to say, I think, he says that paradoxically, those schools in America that focus on teaching the skills, the students that come from those schools, they end up not having them.
Yeah.
Whereas the opposite is the case. Those schools that focus on knowledge, deep knowledge, broad knowledge, the students that come from those schools, they do emerge with critical thinking skills and problem solving skills, and they emerge as creative young people, because they've been introduced to all the great literature and great art and great music that helps them to be creative. You can't create a new piece of music. You can't compose a new piece of music if you haven't heard the great music that's from centuries past. You simply can't.
And it's interesting because I see it. So I've got two kids. I've got an 8 and a 4-year-old. And so my 8-year-old, he's doing the Vikings this coming term at school. And so we bought a book, like 100 crazy facts about the Vikings. And it's interesting seeing his curiosity increase the more we read the book. So when I first got it, he wasn't too interested in it. But now that he knows a little bit about the Vikings, he's now more curious and wants to be more creative with how we discuss what he thinks about the Vikings, because he's got something to like latch it onto. But before, and when there was nothing to latch it onto, it was very difficult for him to become curious about this thing that he had no knowledge of.
Well, that's what Hirsch says. He says knowledge builds on knowledge. It's like Velcro. And if you come to school without that knowledge, you find it very difficult to acquire new knowledge. So that's why it's such a social justice issue, because the advantaged families, the children from those families, they will be able to acquire some knowledge, even in a school that doesn't prioritize knowledge.
Well, this is where it's really interesting to me, right? Because if it is a social justice issue, so if you go on the basis that prior knowledge is a key driver for future learning, and that prior knowledge isn't distributed evenly in society, like some children come with just less knowledge and experience than others, then it really is a kind of a social justice issue. It is quite a moral imperative that we can't just leave it to chance, or it can't be on vibes or on just the latest fad. It has to be, what we do has to be evidence-based then. So I've got two other questions I wanted to ask you on the Hirsch book. One of them leads on directly from that. So this is a quote that was towards the end of his book. So here's the quote, and see what you think. He writes, "Research findings that are accurate and reliable must transcend partisanship and must be seen to do so." And this is something I worry about quite a lot. So our role at Inner Drive, we see ourselves very much as Google Translate. Like, we will take the research and we'll put it into a plain English and make it accessible so that those who matter the most, i.e. teachers, can use it to inform their judgment. And so if there's research around phonics, if there's research around cognitive load theory or retrieval practice, like, the brain essentially in learning doesn't care if you vote left or you vote right. Like, learning is learning. And yet sometimes we have seen in history that people fail to separate the message from the messenger. So phonics under George W. Bush is probably quite a good example of that. We've had some discussions with people where I talk about, here's a really interesting study on cognitive load theory. And the study might look at how you integrate information within a diagram. So quite a non-controversial topic. But they will go, but because Ofsted has mentioned cognitive load theory, or because it's became more prominent under the Conservative government, it gets framed as a political thing as opposed to a learning thing. And so it's interesting to see Hirsch worry about that 20 or 30 odd years ago in this book. I guess my question is, how do we help ensure that these things become cross-party and they're not seen as just a political football? Because it is this important social justice. It's too important for it to be a political sparring ground, essentially. So how did you find, in your experience, how did you bring people with you who might have been from a different political persuasion?
So a couple of things. I mean, when I got back from the beach, I think either when I'd finished the book or when I just had the first day of reading it, I tried to find E.D. Hirsch's email through his publishers and got it, and I emailed him. And in our exchanges, one of the things he said was that don't allow, the right to be seen to be driving this agenda, because otherwise it doesn't gain the consensus that you want within the education system, which is a struggle for me, because I was a spokesman for the Conservative Party on schools in the House of Commons, and had been pushing the phonics agenda even before I read Hirsch. But I always had that warning in the back of my head when pursuing these issues. And if you think about some of the most articulate proponents of the science of learning in Britain, a lot of them are on the left. I don't want to sort of out people as being left-wing, but the Stuart Locks and others who, and there are others who I could mention. I better not. Many of them are not just on the left; they are paid-up members of the Labour Party, and they actively campaign for Labour. And so I've always been very cautious in what I say and do politically, not to be drawn into the too much of this party pre-issues, and certainly not to start championing issues such as the culture wars, for example, that would put off people on the left. Because I do want to bring people with us, because I see no reason, and given the number of really strong proponents of the science of learning who are definitely Labour voters, we know the teaching profession skews left as well. It is important not to allow that to contaminate this debate. Of course, I'm a Conservative politician, a Conservative member of Parliament, and that can't be helped. But I think just the way I tried to go about what I did, I tried to be less sort of party pre and factional in terms of education issues in the House of Commons and on other interviews.
And for anyone listening who might be having a similar wrestle with someone of going phonics, but it doesn't have to be phonics, it could be anything, seen as it's being pushed by certain governments or Ofsted. How did you actually go about bringing people with you on that? Because it's all very good and well going for the people who are already advocates of the science of learning who are a different political persuasion because they naturally agree, they already agree with the message.
Yeah.
For people who might be new to it.
Well, I would make the point that who are the children who most benefit
Yeah.
from a knowledge-rich curriculum, from direct instruction, from a systematic approach to teaching phonics and the teaching of reading? All the evidence from the Pearl study on reading. The reason why we went up to 4th in the world is because of the low attainers.
Right.
Getting a really huge jump in their score, and that pushed up our average. And so the children who most benefit from this are the children from families who are disadvantaged or don't have the advantage of a highly educated family background. So why would you not believe in this in terms of being from the left? And Gramsci, of course, so 1930s Italian communist, he had already twigged this, that these new modern methods were actually, the effect of them was to entrench social inequality in Italy rather than close it.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of these ideas were coming from the left. So I think that those are the kind of arguments that I would try and put to people. And it's a pity that the current government doesn't really understand that. Whereas I think if Blair had been re-elected, if he were the leader of the Labour Party, Prime Minister now, because he did always build on what previous governments had done, I think he would get it. Although some of the things are coming out of the Institute, but the Blair Institute have not.
Which is we could probably do another podcast just on that. Okay, so you mentioned the Pearls where reading improved significantly, which is probably a nice segue into our next area, the first study that we were going to talk about. Because when I asked you beforehand, when we were prepping for this, about what studies had the most impact on your thinking, you answered very quickly about this particular study. And it's kind of informally known as like the Clackmannanshire study. So before we get into the study, just to set the scene, big longitudinal study, tracking over 3,000 students for over 7 years. Students got different reading instruction. So some got synthetic phonics, some got analytic phonics, and there was like a control group. And they want to see over time what impact these different methods would have. Now, before we get into the results, I wanted to read you a transcript that I came across about you talking about the Clackmannanshire study, because it really jumped out to me. So this was on 7th of February in 2005. This was you were part of a parliamentary select committee on education skills. And I found this transcript online. So I'm going to play both parts, both people, one of them being you in this transcript. So person number 1 said, "I believe that children want to learn to read, and if they are given encouragement, they will learn to read." You replied, "Have any of you read the Clackmannanshire study? Have you read it?" Person 2 replies, "No, I have not." You then reply, "You seem to have very strong views on phonics, but you have not read one of the key studies about it, which surprises me, given your position." And as someone, as I mentioned earlier, whose life's work is to make research accessible, I found this conversation interesting on 2 levels. Is one, I don't believe all ministers and MPs are as well read as you have been on the topic. So how do we get more people having read as much as you have read? And 2, the fact that this literacy in phonics was being discussed in Parliament, and at part of the conversation people hadn't even read what we think is one of the most seminal studies in it, is a problem, and is a short failing of people like me, whose job it is to get research as read as possible. So how did you find it, I guess, is my question, with discussing something as important as learning to read, and you had having to discuss it at the time with people who hadn't read what is quite a seminal study in that area?
I mean, hearing that played back to me, I'm just slightly embarrassed by the aggression. I'm always condemning that kind of aggression in politics, but there we are. I was a relatively new MP. No, I think, so I was introduced to the Clackmannanshire study by Ruth Miskin. She told me about it, and the Read and Reform Foundation. So as part of my sort of meeting people and talking and visiting schools, that's how I came across it. And it was so revealing. So what I did with that report then is I sent it to every member of Parliament.
Right.
All 650.
So you sent them the study?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I suggested in my letters to each MP that they might want to raise this with their own local education authority, which I did with mine, asking the Director of Education at West Sussex, this is a really important report. Can you assure me that you are taking this into account when you're, deciding on training for teachers in West Sussex? And so that helped give it some prominence in the House of Commons. And I used that then to ask a question to the Prime Minister about it.
So just on that note, so I've had something similar in the past on a much smaller scale. I find a study and someone who has a different opinion to me on a topic, I go, right, I'll send you the study. And I send them the attachment. I probably send them like 5 studies. And then I used to go, job done. I've sent them the study. Once they've read what I've read, they'll think like me. And I used to bang my head against the wall because it didn't lead to the sort of change that I was hoping it would do. Because either they didn't read the study, or if they read it, they didn't really analyse it properly, or if they did analyse it properly, they still came to a different conclusion. How much success do you think you had in terms of asking people to read studies and they then read it and it leads to them changing their opinion? Or do we need to do more to get people to be more evidence informed? Or is it a case of just accessibility, just putting it in front of them?
Well, in politics, you have to repeat things over and over again.
Yeah.
I remember Cecil Parkinson, a sort of 1980s cabinet minister under Mrs. Thatcher, said that until you are bored silly saying the thing, at that point, the public will just have begun to hear it. And it's the same with these studies. And I used to ask everyone who's interested in reading to read the study, and or just the executive summary of it, and also I would ask everybody to read the E.D. Hirsch book as well. So I became the major salesman of E.D. Hirsch's publisher. But that's what you have to do, I think, really, because people are busy, frankly. And why would they read the thing that you recommended as opposed to the thing that these other friends of they's recommending? People often recommend novels to read, and you think, well, I don't want to read your.
Yeah.
So you just got to repeat and find more imaginative ways to convey it. So I would raise things in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister, and with the Education Secretary Ruth Kelly at the time. I raised, op-eds and so you just got to use every lever that's available to try and promote a particular thing that you think is seminal.
So let's talk about the study then. What for you stood out as the key findings? Why did you think it was such a seminal study for you? If someone if someone listening hasn't heard it or read the study, what were the key takeaways for you from that study?
Well, the key takeaway was that there were 3 groups, as you said, and there was one group that was systematic synthetic phonics. It wasn't Jolly Phonics, but it was based on a scheme very similar to Jolly Phonics. And the results after 16 weeks, and it was a randomized control trial, which is rare in education at the time, more so now since we've had the Education Endowment Foundation that Michael Gove established. So the results after 16 weeks were that they had a word reading age something like 7 months ahead of their chronological age and 8 months ahead of the other 2 groups, something like that. I can't remember the exact numbers. And then they had a spelling age as well.
Yes, I think it was 7 months ahead in reading, and I've got 8 to 9 months ahead in spelling. Yeah.
So this was so significant a difference in just 16 weeks that I felt even just at that point it was very significant. So because it was so successful, they had to move all the children onto the synthetic. It would be immoral not to do so, given those early results. And then the researchers from Hull and St Andrews Universities, Joyce Watson and I forgot her name of the other researcher, they followed them for 7 years, and then at the end of the primary education, they measured their reading age, and they had a reading age of all of them, on average, of 3.5 years ahead of their chronological age, and they had a spelling age of 1 year and 9 months ahead of their chronological age. So this was very, very significant, and I felt that it had to. And I knew that wasn't the method that we were using to teach children to read in our schools.
And just to pick up on that, what I was surprised at when I first read the study, usually what you see in these sort of studies is the effect gets lower and lower over time. So you do an intervention, the effect is quite high after that intervention, but then it's kind of over time people revert back to where they were. Whereas what's interesting about this study is the gap gets bigger over time. So if it's 7 months after 16 weeks difference, but after 7 years, they're now talking about 3.5 years difference. So it even suggests like that early stage is really key and really critical, because it essentially sets people up on different courses that by the end of primary school, you get these huge differences based on what happened 6 or 7 years ago. That's why I think it's quite an exciting study, because the effects grow. It's kind of that Matthew effect, essentially.
No, exactly. And it was the reverse Matthew effect in a way, because it kind of closes the gap between disadvantage and advantage. And it was very different. That method was very different from the way we were teaching children to read, certainly in England schools, with the Searchlights model, where children were expected to almost sort of intuit the new word, from the story, the grammar context, even the picture. And they were not, other than the first letter, they were not encouraged through that system to sound it out based on the sounds of the letters.
Yeah. And that thing about underachieving students kind of catching up, that was one of the things actually I think they pointed out in the studies. The teachers reported it was easier to detect students who were underachieving using this method compared to other methods where perhaps it's easier to hide or it gets lost in the noise.
Yes, exactly.
And of course the teachers and head teachers also reported really positively about the experience of teaching under this method as well, which I think is really important, because in the midst of a bit of a retention crisis, people enjoying doing what they do and getting really exceptional results is kind of the perfect combination, right?
I mean, what could be more satisfying
Yeah.
than having a child who starts in your class completely unable to read, and then a few months later they're reading simple words? It's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like the purest form of learning, I think, is when you see students go through that period of 6 months ago you couldn't read anything, and now you're doing some reading and you're enjoying your relationships with books.
And this thing about children sort of being hidden who can't read, I remember in my constituency listening to the granddaughter of one of my members of the association was reading to me this story from Winnie the Pooh, and she went, Winnie the Pooh went down to the forest. And I was looking at it, and it didn't say Winnie the Pooh, it said Pooh Bear. So they were memorizing the stories, and I think that's what happened. So there are a lot of bright children who were able to remember the story almost word for word, and the teacher would then think they could read because they were pretending to read from memory. And I think they actually felt that was a way of reading, because if they think they can remember that, they'll presumably remember the shape of the word, and therefore they are effectively reading. But of course, a year or so down the line, when they've got to find some words that are really quite complicated, suddenly everyone realizes they can't actually read.
So let's go on to our third and final area. We'll do your second book, Why Don't Students Like School by Daniel T. Willingham. So I was glad when you suggested this book, because for me, I think this is probably the most influential book in the last 20 years in education. It builds on some of E.D. Hirsch's work. I think the two are fairly complementary. But I was wondering why why Willingham's book seems to be it's been so influential in the last 20 years. And I think as well as the content, I don't know what you think, I think the style it's written in is very significant, because often when I read book research or when I read education books, often I feel they're not actually aimed at teachers. Often they're aimed for other researchers or academics. This book was different for me. So to give you a couple of examples that made me think that, and I'll see what you think. So he talks about, for example, his simple learning, his model of memory. And like one of the things he talked about, so the model gets a bit more developed as the book goes along. But like one of the things early on he says, so this is he talks about figure 1.7, which is one of the models. He says, this might be just about the simplest model of the mind possible. So kind of acknowledging that this isn't everything, but it's a good starting point. I had an old psych professor who used to say essentially the quality of a psychological model is the more boxes and arrows it has, the better. And this is kind of the antithesis of that. The other thing I think is really interesting is, so he weaves quite complex and deep cognitive science research. And within the first few pages, there's also quotes from Shakespeare, Kanye West, Henry Ford, and the TV character House. So you don't often get that in most education books. It actually made me laugh out loud. He even referred to Taylor Swift as Tay-Tay And yet it has. So the book doesn't take itself too seriously in some respects, but it's talking about very serious and important things. And I think that accessibility, as well as the content, for me, is why I think it's achieved such significance and has been so well read in the education community. I don't know what you thought on the accessibility part of it.
Yes, I hadn't really considered that. I do know that a lot of academic education research is written in language that's designed to obfuscate or designed to be impenetrable.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons we set up Michael Gove set up the Education Endowment Foundation, was to try and, as well as commissioning its own randomized control trials, it would also look at the evidence that was already out there.
And even within that, so it's very notable, they don't really talk too much about effect sizes, because effect sizes to most people don't actually mean anything. It's very hard to translate that. They talk about additional months progress on average, which is much more understandable. It makes it much more accessible.
Exactly,
I think. Yeah.
Exactly. So what was revealing about Danny Willingham's book was the notion of working memory.
Yeah.
Based on also the work of John Sweller in Australia. And so the idea that the working memory is very small, can only handle half a dozen pieces of new information at once. But it's of course it's the working memory that's where the critical thinking and the problem solving and the creativity takes place. But you can't critically think about how to solve world peace or find a cure for cancer if you've only got 5 pieces of information, and then nor can you just keep looking them up. You can't keep looking up, what DNA is, and because by the time you've looked up 10 things, you've forgotten the first 5. So Willingham says that the purpose of an education is to get knowledge into your long-term memory that the working memory can draw on with ease. Yeah. And that to me just gave the complete explanation about why it is important to have a knowledge-rich curriculum for the Hirsch reasons of knowledge building on knowledge, but also if you want those skills that we all want in a modern economy, you need knowledge in your long-term memory. And this whole notion of cognitive load theory, I think that's hugely important.
It's interesting, so because I think the main quote that most people know from his book is "memory is the residue of thought."
Yes.
Like that is featured in countless presentations, I think, up and down the land. What I found interesting for me wasn't so much the limitations of working memory. I think most people, even if they don't think through the consequence of it, intuitively know that working memory is short. What I found really interesting, I guess, for me was by saying memory is the residue of thought, is it then opens up the conversation of like, how do we increase memory? So talking about work about desirable difficulties like retrieval practice, like spacing and interleaving, because although I think those things are important, if you do go down a knowledge-rich curriculum, very much you want to talk about, well, what are the means to cement that knowledge? And memory is the residue of thought is a great starting point to talk about desirable difficulties and the importance of retrieval practice. Because I think for years, I think I said this on a previous pod, I think for years people thought you do a lot of learning and then you do a quiz just to assess how much has been learned. Whereas if you start thinking about memory is the residue of thought, then actually quizzing doesn't just assess the learning, quizzing can actually accelerate the learning because it prompts you to think hard. So then it opens up a whole world of opportunity of how else do I get people to think hard? What are the strategies and activities we should do in the classroom that prompt that hard thinking? And I think that was so seminal from his book.
I agree. And what's been wonderful to see over the last sort of 10 years or so is the proliferation of people like you and others who are talking about these things in conferences, on podcasts, and in the 1,200 teacher blogs that there are in this country, who are taking these ideas and then translating them into better practice in the classroom, such as interleaving and retrieval practice and so on. But what was important to me as a policymaker with the Willingham book is that it enabled us it gave me an argument against all those who dominated education policy thinking, who said that you don't need to rote learning is a bad thing, and that you don't need to, children do not need to remember things because they can always look it up.
Yeah.
And even today, as we discussed earlier, that is still a very dominant viewpoint. But the Willingham book absolutely kills that argument.
Yeah.
Because you simply do not get those skills that we all want from our young people if you don't have knowledge in your long-term memory. And it's a compelling, I think, irrefutable argument about why knowledge is important.
Yeah. And as I say, I just think he was the first, for me, cognitive scientist who really spoke to teachers about those things. And what I think is so impressive is once you have that knowledge, you can then pass that to the teachers. They can work out how best to apply it. Like researchers can never tell you exactly what you should be doing next Thursday in your year 9 French lesson. They can tell you these principles like cognitive load and working memory, and then it can inform the judgment of teachers, which I think his book definitely did. Now, he talks about cognitive load in it quite a lot, which is something that you caught your eye. And so one of the quotes I thought was quite interesting is, so he did Memory is the Residue of Thought. It's probably the most well-known quote. I think he does like one key quote or sentiment per chapter. The other one that really caught my eye was, don't expect novices to learn by doing what experts do. And that's very much at the heart of cognitive load. So if cognitive load theory is essentially you don't want to overload working memory because it's small and long-term memory is large, then it opens up a discussion about novices versus experts because novices have less in their long-term memory, and so therefore it's easier for their working memory to become overloaded. And I think that's quite a significant shift, because then we don't teach science by doing what professional scientists do because they have long-term memory, a lot in it. So I don't know if that kind of resonated with you, but I thought that was a very interesting way into cognitive load theory.
It's hugely important issue, because everything that was happening in schools in England, probably elsewhere, and in Scotland and Wales as well, I'm sure, was that you were teaching. It's even in the curriculum that we've revised, and it's still in there. It didn't win every argument, every debate, but working scientifically is in the primary curriculum, and thinking like a historian is in the secondary curriculum, and so on. So these ideas are that you can teach a novice the skills of a historian, how to understand sources and evidence and this kind of thing, chronology, and how to work scientifically, understand that there's a thesis and you need an experiment and you will record the results and from which you draw a conclusion and so on. That all these skills can be taught to a novice who doesn't really know the difference between a halogen and something else. And and Daisy talks about this in her 7 Myths about education, brilliant book, that you just simply cannot teach those skills to a novice, because the expert who has those skills has spent 20 years, 30 years acquiring the knowledge of their discipline that enables them to have the skills of how to think scientifically. And then the other thing that comes from that is that those skills are domain specific. And Daisy encapsulates that really well when she says, you can be a problem solver in mathematics, but don't expect that problem solver to fix your car. It's problem solving in one domain. It's very different from problem solving in a different domain.
Well, not to give too many spoilers, we have an upcoming episode with Daisy. We've done one previously on AI with her. We have one coming up about research on prior knowledge, which very much echoes that exact sentiment. Now, when we talk about novices and experts and cognitive load theory, one of the things that it wasn't so much in Willingham's book, it actually came up in Hirsch's book, but it's been very much in sync with what Willingham says about cognitive load, is the work by David Geary on primary and secondary knowledge, which I think is really interesting, because sometimes you hear this argument that if I look at toddlers, like they learn to walk, they learn to talk. Yes, you can do some stuff to prompt it, but by and large, they'll get that through assimilation, just by like being around people. And they learn at this amazingly fast rate. So therefore, that's often used as an argument. So therefore, we should let kids, we want to tap into that for maths and reading and science. But of course, the work of cognitive load theory suggests that those are quite two different domains, being able to walk and talk versus learning how to read, for example. And I think that comes up in both Hirsch's book and in Willingham's book.
Well, reading is an artificial human-created construct.
Yeah.
Walking and talking is not. They're biological, and children will pick up those things, but they won't pick up reading unless they're explicitly taught. And they certainly won't pick up maths unless they're explicitly taught. So this kind of romantic view that somehow just, let them just flourish and it'll all happen just in just real books, and they'll pick it up and they'll get it. I mean, for some children, they do learn easily how to read. It's particularly if they're in a household where there's a lot of vocabulary around and a lot of reading happening. But for too many children, and this is what we were seeing, prior to 2010, you'd go into schools and they were using these kind of methods, whole language approaches or real books approaches to teaching reading, and you'd meet these. You meet a 9-year-old girl. I specifically remember this particular example in a school in North London who simply couldn't read a single word at 9, and there's no reason for that.
Yeah.
No matter how however weak she was academically, intellectually, she could still have learned to read way before she was age 9, fluently and effortlessly, if she'd been taught, and they just hadn't been teaching it in that school.
As you say, that moral imperative and social justice.
Yes, and this child was a couple of years away from secondary school.
Yeah,
it's just going to sink. No, it's. I'm hoping that we won't see children like that today in primary schools, because phonics really is, I think, embedded now in most primary schools.
Well, and probably in no small part due to the work of E.D. Hirsch, the Clapp-Manager study, and the Daniel Willingham book in part.
Yes, and people like Ruth Miskin and the Reading Reform Foundation, and the phonics screening check that we introduced, and Michael Gove, when he was Education Secretary, that has made schools focus on teaching phonics in the way they teach reading. And we changed the teacher standards, we changed Ofsted to make sure that was the requirement. And we changed the national curriculum to require teachers to teach systematic synthetic phonics in the teaching of reading. And it has had an impact. I mean, there's some schools do it better than others, no question. But if you go to any primary school now in England, you will see phonics being taught.
Yeah. Well, I think that's pretty much all we have time for. I started this episode by saying I was told you were one of the most well-read ministers and across your brief, and I was dying to know what were some of the research and books that influenced your thinking that you've been reading. So thank you for taking the time to share those 3 with us. I really appreciate it. For everyone listening, please do let us know what you think on the episode. Please do comment, above all, subscribe. Nick, thank you so much for your time today.
It's a pleasure, Bev.
I really appreciate it. For everyone else, see you at the next episode. Bye.
If you've enjoyed this episode and want to improve your staff's understanding of the science of learning, you'd simply love Inner Drive's training. We offer brilliant in-person workshops plus online support through the Teachers CPD Academy, trusted by thousands of teachers worldwide. Simply email us now at info@innerdrive.co.uk to take your staff's professional development to the next level.